In the golden light of the marble columns, the 16-year-old princess trembles, not from the cool Mediterranean breeze, but from an ancient pain that pierces her to the bone. In this room, which smells of myrrh and papyrus dust, her body has finally ceased to belong to her. In the luxurious chambers of Alexandria, covered with purple, fragrant fabrics, Arsinoe Sumbo Philadelphus lay motionless. Her body trembled not from the cold coming through the high windows, but from something much darker and more cruel. On that night, she left the world of childhood forever, and not of her own free will. Her father, Ptolemy I Soter, the renowned general of Alexander the Great and the new ruler of Egypt, had completed what he had arrogantly called dynastic preparation. Arsinoe's tears had long since dried, and only the deafening silence reminded her that power had decided for her. Her body had become the territory of strangers' desires and cruel calculations. They say that the body does not lie, and every tremor of her skin spoke of what no court scribe would dare to write. In these marble halls where the secrets of the most powerful dynasty of Hellas were kept, the most bitter truth was born. The purity of royal blood was redeemed by the innocence of daughters. To understand how all this could have happened, let us return to the distant year 316 BC, when the entire Hellenistic world was still reeling from the echoes of the Macedonian campaigns, and hymns in honor of the victors rang out from the banks of the Nile to the borders of India. It was then that a girl was born in the house of the Ptolemies, who was destined to inherit both the crown and a curse. Arsinoe was born in Alexandria, the city where the famous Lighthouse of Alexandria was built, where the library kept scrolls with the discoveries of Euclid and Archimedes, and where trade caravans from the Red Sea brought spices and silk from distant India. Her father, Ptolemy I Soter, was one of Alexander's closest associates. After the death of the Macedonian king in 323 BC, he easily proclaimed himself pharaoh and turned Egypt into the pearl of the ancient world, the breadbasket of the Mediterranean and the cradle of a new Hellenistic culture. Arsinoe's mother, Berenice the Querns, once the muse of Antigonus, now queen, gave birth to heirs and set the tone for court intrigues. She saw her daughter not as a child, but as a political tool, a precious asset capable of forging alliances and consolidating the power of the Ptolemies. From an early age, Arsinoe amazed everyone with her sharp mind. Before she was 6, she could read Greek, Egyptian, and Aramaic, leaf through papyri in the royal library, and tried to understand how the huge granaries near the Nile worked. She was fascinated by the thoroughness of Egyptian priests and their mummification rituals, and would stand for hours at the sarcophagus, studying the intricate hieroglyphs describing the soul's journey to Duat. Her tutors drilled the laws of court etiquette into her and instilled in her a belief in the sanctity of blood ties, saying that only through marriages within the family could the blessing of the gods be preserved. But no one warned her of the price this purity would cost. At 14, Arsinoe's body began to change, and from that moment on, her father's gaze lost its familiar tenderness, replaced by the shrewd gleam of a power-hungry man. Ptolemy began to spend more and more time with her under the pretext of preparing her for the throne. The courtiers fell silent at the doors of her chambers, the guards were given strict orders not to disturb her, and her mother hid behind closed doors more and more often, immersed in long prayers and painful silence. The princess learned to build an invisible armor around her soul, which hid the broken pieces of her inner world from the public. During the day, she smiled with the grace expected of an heir to the throne, displaying courtesy and royal manners. But when the court fell asleep and a chill swept through the palace halls, she felt as if she were no longer the mistress of her own body. It had been taken over by someone else, torn between duty, fear and self-hatred. In her room, she drew invisible lines in the sand of the marble floor, trying to gather the remnants of the girl who had once been allowed to run through the palace's blooming gardens and laugh without a care in the world. Behind the golden curtains of Alexandria, the Diadochi continued to forge plans. Priests praised the greatness of the Ptolemaic throne, and lavish feasts were replaced by even more luxurious ones. No one seemed to notice how slowly the young heiress was fading away. And then, at the age of 16, Arsinoe received news that would change her entire past and turn her future upside down. At 16, Arsinoe already knew the fear that many soldiers only experience on the battlefield. Her marriage turned out to be a cold trap rather than a union of hearts. Her father, Ptolemy I Soter, once a comrade in arms of Alexander the Great and ruler of Egypt, had agreed to marry his daughter to Lysimachus, king of Thrace and veteran of the Macedonian campaigns. The young bride was needed to strengthen his dynasty, and Ptolemy needed her for a political alliance. Arsinoe met this news with frightening calm. She understood that marriage was not a reward, but a silent sentence that would push her further away from the throne. Rumors of her aloofness and frequent absences created unnecessary worries at court, and sending her north seemed a sensible decision from both a political and personal point of view. The marriage ceremony by proxy took place in the Ptolemaic palace in Alexandria. Lysimachus' envoy, dressed in a purple tunic, stood in the middle of the throne room, surrounded by marble columns and frescoes depicting the exploits of the Heliopolitan gods. Arsinoe appeared in a white peplos embroidered with gold thread. At that time, it was considered a symbol of purity, but for her it turned into a funeral shroud. No tears, no smiles, only frozen severity and the realization that in this spectacle, she was assigned the role of an elegant victim. When the ship carrying her to Thrace left the shore, Arsinoe saw the silhouette of the famous Pharos lighthouse for the last time. She was only 16, but inside she already felt more pain than many veterans. 3 weeks of rocking on the Mediterranean Sea became a time of rethinking. The waves quietly lulled her thoughts, helping her to map out her future power in her mind. The pharaoh's daughter no longer trembled in the corridors of the royal palace. Pain had become her strict teacher, teaching her to read intentions in glances, to sense danger in silence, and to turn apparent vulnerability into a political weapon. In the port of Lysimachia, Lysimachus greeted her with great flattery and a noisy reception. Chariots, trumpeters, warriors in armor, decorated with the emblems of the Thracian Savsia. Before her stood a mighty man with gray hair and scars on his face, like scratches from battles. He was 60 years old, but he still had the ferocity that had led him alongside Alexander in the battles of Asia. However, his eyes betrayed the weariness of a man who had looked into the eyes of earthly gods and lived to see their downfall. Arsinoe expected violence, but instead Lysimachus treated her gently, as if she were a fragile vase filled with hidden poison. On the first night, when she lay in the marriage bed preparing for the worst, he sat down beside her and began to talk about Alexander's great deeds: the battle of the Hydaspes, the storming of the fortress of Bactria. There was no touch, no reminder of marital duty, only words and stories about the past of a great dynasty. And in the weeks that followed, he did not dare to break this distance, but taught her the subtleties of Thracian politics. He told her about relations with the Odrysian and Bessian tribes, explained the tricks of diplomacy, and whispered about the pitfalls of court intrigues. Gradually, Arsinoe's heart stopped trembling with fear. She began to breathe more freely, but her peace was not to last long. In Thrace, as everywhere in the Hellenistic world, power devoured the weak. Agathocles, Lysimachus' eldest son from a previous marriage, saw her as an enemy. The young Egyptian queen threatened his right to the throne. Arsinoe sensed his hostility at first glance. Agathocles' eyes burned with neither desire nor respect, but with cold, calculating hatred. She realized that she had jumped from one cage to another and decided to learn how to survive. Thus began her real political education. Arsinoe wove a network of alliances with Thracian commanders, won the favor of influential ladies at court, and quietly manipulated the ambitions of courtiers. Every smile was calculated, every gesture deliberate, and every word weighed more than gold. For 5 years she ruled Thrace like a true queen. As Lysimachus grew older, he relied more and more on her flexible mind. Under her leadership, lucrative trade agreements were concluded with neighboring satraps, financial reforms were carried out, and even a new coinage was introduced. Her image was minted on silver tetradrachms for the first time, alongside that of Lysimachus. When the Thracian tribes rebelled and began to plunder the caravan route, she designed a system of watchtowers and organized a guard that restored prosperity to the land. The pain of her youth did not disappear without a trace. It became fuel for her ambitions. But fate had a new blow in store for her. In 281 BC, when Arsinoe was 35 years old, Lysimachus was killed in the Battle of Corupedion, fighting against Seleucus I. With him, the fragile stability they had built over a decade collapsed. The victor's first order was the immediate expulsion of Arsinoe. Executing her would have been too dangerous. It would have provoked the wrath of Egypt. But keeping her in the kingdom as a threat was also impossible. She was given 3 days to gather her belongings, priceless jewelry secretly hidden in her chambers, and a tiny guard, everything that could fit into a small chest. So Arsinoe left Thrace, taking with her only gold and political experience as sharp as a blade. When the ships of Ptolemy's fleet first appeared on the horizon, her heart beat faster, as if recognizing the familiar walls from which she had fled 20 years earlier. Arsinoe's return to Alexandria was not a stroll down memory lane, but a harsh test where it was not her comfort that was at stake, but her power. At the age of 35, Arsinoe found herself once again without a home or protection, armed only with a sharp mind and a will forged in years of suffering. But she was no longer the naive girl she had been. Before her stood a woman who had learned the main rule of Hellenistic politics: power is not given, it must be taken. The road back to Egypt turned into a kind of pilgrimage to a past she wanted to forget. When, on a clear evening, the famous lighthouse and the white columns of Pharos appeared on the horizon outside Alexandria, Arsinoe felt a lump in her throat. Here, on the banks of the Nile, she had lost her innocence and honor. Here, her own father, Ptolemy I Soter, had made her a hostage to dynastic ambitions. But the Egypt that greeted her now was no longer the same place. The great monarch had died, and the throne had passed to her brother Ptolemy II, 40 years old, a man with the same steely gaze as their father. The meeting turned out to be an elaborate ritual of politeness, behind which lay abysses of old grudges and mutual reckonings. Ptolemy II knew about the rumors of his father's cruelty, and his welcoming tone betrayed a mixture of guilt and quiet admiration. Arsinoe looked at her brother with the cold gaze of a political analyst, trying to read the meaning behind his every gesture. Soon she realized that Egypt was on the brink of chaos: rebellion in Cyrenaica, growing debts, and intrigues by Hellenistic kings eager to destroy the Ptolemaic kingdom. Her brother desperately needed a reliable ally, someone with no claim to the throne. Arsinoe did not hesitate to seize the opportunity. Within a few months, she became the invisible architect of politics, whispering royal advice in a small circle, drawing up financial statements, and developing plans to strengthen the borders. The secretary even attributed her wisdom to reforms in grain debt and the expansion of Egyptian merchant caravans to Ethiopia. Gradually, she became an indispensable advisor. The winter of 276 BC was harsh. The desert winds of Alexandria's harbor bent the palm trees, and at night the mezzanine of the royal chambers smelled of incense and silk. On one such cold night, Ptolemaic invited Arsinoe to his chambers. The atmosphere was such that every word could change the fate of the world. He spoke of priests, of obligations to the gods, of the need to strengthen the dynasty. Finally, he made a proposal that shook her to the core: a marriage between siblings, the pinnacle of Ptolemaic politics, the most ancient way of preserving the purity of blood and the legitimacy of power. In the silence, thick as the harbinger of a sandstorm, Arsinoe felt the remnants of the girl inside her tear apart, memories of violence and lost trust. She could have refused, opposed the insane ritual, defied tradition, and lost the power she had spent 2 long decades striving for. But at that moment, a new goal was born from the ashes of her past suffering: to become an untouchable queen, whose power would be unbreakable. The girl who had once been humiliated by her own father was dead. In her place stood a woman ready to use the same chains that had broken her. The wedding ceremony in the Temple of Ptah was a stunning spectacle. Priests in linen robes proclaimed the union a gift from the gods. The crowd of Greek and Egyptian nobility enthusiastically joined in ancient hymns, and the common people humbly accepted yet another exotic tradition of their pharaoh leaders. But for Arsinoe, this was not a marriage. It was a coronation. Ascending the altar, she did not walk toward her husband. She entered into a union with absolute power itself. The traumas of her youth never disappeared, but now she had learned to turn them into a driving force for power. In the years that followed, Arsinoe, as a queen philosopher and strategist, effectively ruled alongside Ptolemaic. She reorganized the treasury, introduced strict grain accounting, established new trade routes across the Red Sea, and concluded treaties with the Syrian and Thracian kings. Her profile appeared alongside that of Ptolemy II on copper and silver coins, symbolizing her almost divine status. Ambassadors from the farthest corners of the eastern Mediterranean knew that if you wanted to do business with Egypt, you had to talk to Arsinoe. But power secured at such a high price required the preservation of an identical dynastic order. When courtiers proposed formalizing incestuous marriages as an integral part of future generations, Arsinoe did not simply agree. She became the leader of this tradition, turning incest from a taboo into a political tool that no one would dare challenge. Imagine a legend that became its own instrument of destruction, a goddess who cursed herself with a bloody law of power. Arsinoe the Q was the first to complicate the rules of dynastic marriage to a degree that made the blood run cold. It was she who introduced theological justifications that turned family oppression, even close kinship, into the highest court ritual. The archives of the Library of Alexandria mention temples where priests revered the love of brothers and sisters as sacred as the sacrificial fires of Apollo. In moments of rare clarity, Arsinoe bitterly realized the irony of fate that had made her the architect of a system in which she herself had become a prisoner. First, she married Lysimachus of Macedon. Then, for political reasons, she swore allegiance to her brother Ptolemy II, becoming not only his mentor, but also his wife. Even then, dynastic incest was seen as a great mystery that guaranteed the inviolability of the throne. In 270 BC, Arsinoe II died in Alexandria at the age of 46. Ptolemy II immediately ordered her to be deified. Soon, temples to the goddess Philadelphus, or Sister of Love, as her priests called her, were erected throughout Egypt, emphasizing her connection to her brothers. Coins of that time bore her image, and statues crowned the colonnades of Delphi and Memphis. The name sounded more like a curse than an honor. Arsinoe's politics outlived her body by 2 centuries. Marriages between brother and sister became a hallmark of the Ptolemies. Day after day, the dynasty sank into a vicious circle, from which it emerged only with the birth of Cleopatra Zeta, the last brilliant representative of the family. Excavations in Thebes and Edfu confirm that the royal family's marriage records were filled with close-kin marriages and bloody rituals in the name of preserving power. This is not just a story about Arsinoe based on Dofil del F. It is a universal story about how we often turn the wounds inflicted on us into weapons against others. Arsinoe was not only a powerful queen, but also living proof that power can disfigure even those who have survived the most brutal suffering. Today, when we hear news reports about influential families where evil is passed down like a family curse, the ghost of Arsinoe whispers from the sands of Alexandria, "Power does not heal emotional wounds, it only sharpens them."